Early on the morning of June 14, 1994, Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman were found brutally murdered at Brown's Los Angeles home. On June 17th, after the LAPD asked Brown's ex-husband and former football star O.J. Simpson to surrender himself in connection with the murders, he instead led them on a prolonged car chase across Los Angeles in a white Bronco.
I'm the only one that deserves.
No, you don't deserve that.
Get hurt.
You do not deserve to get hurt. You do not deserve to get hurt. Don't do this.
All I did was love Nicole. All I did was love her.
O.J. Simpson's famous criminal and civil cases have drawn attention both because of his celebrity and the surprising criminal acquittal. In 1995, a jury acquitted Simpson of both counts of first-degree murder. 2 years later, however, in 1997, a jury found Simpson liable in wrongful death suits brought by the families of the victims. How can someone be found not guilty but liable for the same crime? And what do those results say about our legal system? This video looks at the different outcomes in Simpson's civil and criminal trials and offers possible explanations based on procedural differences in the two systems and biases at play throughout the proceedings. Several important details help explain what was to many a surprising acquittal in Simpson's criminal trial. A good place to start is with jury selection. To avoid allegations of racism, the prosecution decided to hold the trial in downtown LA as opposed to in Santa Monica, leading to a far more diverse jury than they might have had. The jury ended up with 9 black jurors, 2 white jurors, and 1 Hispanic juror. The prosecution also tried to seek out female jurors, with the hope that they would be more sympathetic to Brown as a domestic violence victim. The jury ended up having 10 women and 2 men. A second key element of the criminal trial was the specter of race relations. Just a few years previously, LA had been embroiled in riots which followed the brutal beating of Rodney King by the LAPD. Simpson's defense portrayed the LAPD as a manifestation of institutional racism and raised the possibility of their deliberately framing Simpson. Officer Mark Furman, who testified about the evidence against Simpson, was found to have previously made racist statements, significantly undermining his credibility as a witness.
You ever try to find a bruise on a nigger? Pretty tough, huh? Sure, something like this. First thing, anything out of a nigger's mouth for the first 5 or 6 sentences is a fucking lie.
After Simpson's acquittal in his criminal trial, the families of the 2 victims brought a civil suit against him for wrongful death. This time, the trial was held in Santa Monica. The jury composition reflected this difference, ending up with 8 out of 12 white jurors. Additionally, the jury was made up of 7 women and 5 men. There were other notable differences between the 2 cases. In the criminal trial, Simpson exercised his right to not testify. In the civil trial, however, the plaintiffs were able to compel him to testify, and one juror later said that he was not credible on the stand. There was new evidence in the civil case as well. A photograph of Simpson wearing the type of shoes that had left bloody footprints at the crime scene, shoes he had denied even owning. The judge also made several crucial decisions. He did not allow any media recording at the trial, and he ruled that allegations that the police investigators were racist were impermissible as they were inflammatory and speculative. At the end of the trial, Simpson was found liable, which means that the jury found it more likely than not that his intentional and unlawful conduct resulted in the victim's death. He was ordered to pay $33.5 million, an amount considered surprisingly large. To this day, he still owes tens of millions of dollars on the judgment.
The differences already mentioned between the civil and criminal trials help explain the different outcomes. When Simpson took the stand in the civil trial, it allowed the plaintiffs to bring up the inconsistencies in his various accounts of the night. The new evidence in the civil trial, including the photos of Simpson wearing the same type of shoes that made the footprints at the crime scene, gave the plaintiff's case additional weight. Civil trials also have a lower standard of proof, given that the question is one of liability rather than guilt. In a criminal trial, a defendant is in danger of losing his liberty and even his life. In a civil trial, only property is at risk. These differences occurred through the lens of a significantly less publicized trial, which helped reduce some of the social pressures on the jury and the court. We hypothesize that the increased social pressures and publicity of the criminal trial helped bring identity to the forefront of the trial. It increased the likelihood that the jurors felt they were representing their communities in addition to the court. Another difference between the 2 trials is that the juries had very different compositions, with the civil trial having a less black and female-dominated jury. The differences in jury identities and the ways in which their biases were shaped provides an interesting lens for thinking about many of the larger forces at play. An example of this is the criminal prosecution's faulty assumption that women would be more sympathetic to the domestic violence components of the case. data has shown that women actually tend to be less likely to convict defendants of domestic violence. A compelling reason for this is the role that system justification can play in women's evaluation of these cases. There's a tendency to avoid confronting the horror of domestic violence and the threat that it poses. One means of doing this is to justify the system by externalizing domestic violence and attributing it to other factors, such as women's choices and distinct circumstances, rather than blaming it on the abuser.
Additionally, the significantly wider jury in the civil trial arguably weakened the power of the defense's narrative that this case was an example of racial subordination. Opinions about Simpson's guilt were sharply split along racial lines. System justification suggests that black jurors in the criminal case might blame Simpson for his predicament, rather than question the system's legitimacy. Several key differences help explain this apparent tension. A first is that Officer Furman did not testify in the civil trial. This, in combination with the lack of media spectacle, meant the civil trial did not bring racial identity to the forefront of the case to the extent that the criminal trial did. This could have led to a decreased likelihood that jurors in the civil case viewed Simpson as a product of his situation, framed by dispositionist actors in the LAPD. A second is that the system's legitimacy with regard to race in LA was already crumbling at the time of the criminal trial, and this made competing systems of racial solidarity more relevant than those of the justice system. A lack of perceived legitimacy in the criminal justice system allowed the defense to effectively undermine the police's credibility and to encourage juror skepticism about procedural justice. This is indicated by the jurors' tendency to think Simpson may have been guilty, but insistence that the prosecution failed to sufficiently prove his guilt. Alan Dershowitz, one of Simpson's defense attorneys, said of the criminal trial that the system worked, and it worked too well. It showed that, in fact, the system will operate on the principle of better 10 guilty go free than 1 innocent be wrongly convicted. It makes sense that this legitimacy gap would apply less to the civil system, where there is a weaker connection to the police force and other mechanisms of power typically associated with racial oppression. Ultimately, the two juries reaching different conclusions is not a problem for our legal system. The difference between showing guilt and showing liability is a significant one, and procedurally, the evidence presented differed substantially. Even when the criminal justice system finds a defendant not guilty, our tort system can empower victims to seek some form of redress.